Today we have the opportunity to share another rebroadcast of Kira Dineen's podcast and radio show, DNA Today. In this episode, Kira discusses the genetic counseling graduate program interview process, and one of her guests is Brynna Nguyenton, a member of KGI's first cohort of genetic counseling students. To listen to more genetic-themed episodes with guests such as genetic counselors, patient advocates, researchers, professors, and more, check out Kira's feed by searching DNA Today in your podcast app. You can also go directly to dnapodcast.com to stream more than 95 episodes.
Hello, you're listening to DNA Today, a genetics podcast and radio show. I'm your host, Kira Dineen. DNA Today informs you on what's happening in the genetic world, and during my broadcast here, I educate you, the public, on genetic and health topics through news and interviews. Guests include genetic counselors. We have some future genetic counselors on today's episode. Researchers, doctors, patient advocates, and professors. And as I said, we've got some future genetic counselors on today's episode, and so it's going to be a little bit different because we have a panel of us, and we're going to be discussing the genetic counseling graduate school application process. And this is a follow-up episode, kind of a part 2 to an earlier show that focused on the application itself in deciding which schools to apply to. And if you haven't heard that yet and haven't applied to schools yet, definitely give that a listen because I think we share a lot of personal experiences in that and what we learned going through the process either once or twice. And so this episode is going to pick up where we left off in terms of now your applications have hopefully been submitted and you're waiting for interviews. So we're going to talk about the interviews itself, the ranking system and how that works, and then finally the long-awaited match day. So as I said, this discussion, I'm joined again by some fellow applicants who are in the same application cycle as myself. We started in 2017 at the end of the year, and were matched in 2018 April 27th was our big day. So I'm Kira Dineen, and I'm attending Sarah Lawrence.
I'm Katie Church. I'm attending the University of Alabama, Birmingham.
This is Brianna. I'm excited to be back, and I'm attending the University of British Columbia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brynna, and I will be attending Keck Graduate Institute.
And Brynna, do you want to start us off on kind of reminding people the overall timeline of the application cycle?
Yeah, of course. So, as I'm sure most of your audience members already know, that applications generally open in August and early September, and they're usually due around December and January, but it's usually best to start these applications as soon as possible because they're pretty lengthy and life gets in the way all the time, so you just never know. And then usually around late January to March is when the interview invitations start rolling around, and then interviews happen after that around February and early April. And then, like you mentioned, this past year, our match day was April 27th, so that was the big day to look out for.
Yeah, so match day is kind of the end of April, somewhere around there. So now we're going to get into the interviews. And so for some people, this is kind of really the most nerve-wracking part because you can get some curveballs and everything. How many interviews did you guys receive? And I guess also how many schools you applied to for frame of reference?
So I was the atypical applicant, and I applied to 11 schools, which was a very expensive application process and everything, but I don't regret it, and I received 2 interviews, and it goes to show it only takes one to get in a school, so just something to keep in mind.
And I'm from Canada, where we only have 4 schools. My first application cycle, which was the previous year, I applied to 3 schools and interviewed at 3. And then this past year, I applied to 3 schools and interviewed at 1.
I applied to 7 schools and then interviewed at 6 of them.
And I was similar to that. I applied to 7 and then interviewed at 7. When we walked into interview day, what did it look like, and how much really, I guess, warning or a schedule did we get ahead of time?
So in my experience, it really depends on the program. So usually schools, once you confirm your interview date and everything, they'll send you an itinerary of what you can expect on that day and the schedule. And they're usually about 5 or so 25-minute interviews that I had with staff and faculty. And sometimes, depending on if you're in the morning half or the afternoon half of the interview date, then you would have lunch with the other interviewees. And then some programs also have a writing exercise or an article discussion as well.
Yeah, I had a couple of interviews that also had group interviews. And then a number of them had like a get together informally with the students like the night before or later that evening after the interview. And while the students don't get back to the program directors or anything about what happens or what you say, like that's kind of the chance to get to ask any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking somebody that's on faculty. It was a really good way to get to know more about the program and get to kind of get a better feel for it.
How was the group interviews? Because I didn't
noticed the same
have
thing.
any of those, but I've heard that they existed.
I had one, and it was more of like a problem solving thing. We were given a prompt and had to all collectively decide on one right answer. And it was a situation that was more of like an ethical dilemma. Like there wasn't a right answer. So it was just trying to see how we all work together.
And did you do the entire interview together, or was it separate?
It was one section of it. So we had a handful of one-on-one interviews with faculty, and then in addition had the group interview.
And how did you guys prepare for, your interview days? Was there certain things that you would go through to practice, or what was your really strategy?
Preparing like in advance for the interview process. As a whole, I did a lot of like personal reflection and studying, because in my first year, I felt as though a couple of things I missed is that I didn't reflect enough on myself and my experiences and why my experiences have helped me grow and prepared me for the program and for the career. So I spent a lot of time just like reflecting on myself, and my different experiences and my strengths and my weaknesses. And then I also studied, because I found in my first year of applications, I didn't really have the lingo. And I've said that in the previous episode as well. I wasn't able to have a fluent conversation about the field of genetic counseling. I did a lot of research on like, what is a genetic counselor? What do they do? But in regards to the actual process of genetic counseling, I couldn't talk about, current events or anything. So I studied up on current events and research in the field. And then I also studied up a bit on ethical dilemmas in genetic counseling, just because I figured, if a question is asked, a scenario question, what could I know that would help me answer that more professionally?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Brynna said. It's really important to be fluent when you're talking about things that relate to genetic counseling, to show that you're literate and you have knowledge of the field even before going into it. For me, I reviewed all of my application materials, especially my personal statement, and tried to really draw and put some of my experiences when I was actually interviewing. Just like Brynna said, it's really important to show how your experiences have shaped you into the person that you are, and to show how the person who you are now would make a great genetic counselor. And what I also found helpful was preparing elevator speeches for really broad questions and generic questions like the classic, tell me about yourself, and why is genetic counseling a good fit for you? Or how did you hear about genetic counseling? It's really easy in an interview setting to just kind of ramble on, and I felt like if I practiced these speeches beforehand and it was like within a minute, then I could really execute them on the day of the interview. And another thing I also found helpful was to review some common interview questions through Google searches and program websites. And I think the most important for me was making a list of questions to ask during my interview, whether it was about the program or the profession. I think that programs really want to see that you're engaging with your interviewer and that you're interested in what they had to say.
The advice I got from my genetic counseling bosses were to list the top 5 things you want to bring up on interview day. I found this to be very helpful. Some people, are good at like practicing specific answers, and that can be really helpful. For me, though, I think it was better to look at, okay, I want to, talk about these internships. I want to talk about this project I did, and really keep in mind those top 5 things. And during the interview, I would kind of like check them off in my head and been like, all right, I already mentioned this. So when asked a question, I would then think about a different experience I could pull from so that I was kind of showing myself as very well-rounded. And I think, also practicing some questions because people are not good at talking about themselves, they find. That, you have these ideas in your head, but to actually talk about them can be a little difficult sometimes. What kind of answers would you say students should kind of do that to sit down and interview themselves, I guess? What types of topics came up in your interviews?
In mine, I think answers to think about before you walk in. There is the famous strengths and weakness question. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Not all committees asked me, and I would believe ask this question to other people. But I do think that it is important to have an idea because it can really throw you off, especially since sometimes, you'll give one weakness and they'll be looking for a different kind of weakness. You'll give a weakness about how you interact with people and they'll instead want a more personal weakness. So it's good to think, reflect on that. And then other answers, I think a good thing to prepare ahead of time is behavioral questions. A couple instances. So I believe you were just touching on this, Kira, having a couple experiences that you can draw on for different questions. So behavioral questions are the ones that start with, tell me about a time when you blank. And so examples could be, had to deliver bad news or had a conflict with a superior. And sometimes having experiences for a number of those is good so that you can pull on them in times of need. And other than that, I just really think reflecting on who you are and how your experiences have helped you grow, which is what we've talked about already. A couple of those things are really important to do to prepare.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point of, having those experiences to pull from and stuff of specific examples, because you can find yourself just freezing up even if you've practiced certain things. So almost to have a bank of experiences in your head, there was this one time this happened with my boss, or I witnessed this during a genetic counseling session or something, so that you can somehow tie it into a question.
Exactly. Yeah, because you'll really underestimate how much you'll forget about your life experiences.
Yes.
And when you're sitting in that chair.
Yeah, and to add on to that, people at these programs, they really want to know who you are as a person and how you be a great genetic counselor and how you fit into their program. So it's important to think about it and they're not exactly judging you, but more wanting to get to know who you are as a person. And if you have a bank of these experiences, it's not simply listing them off as you did on the application, but it's more applying it to your life and your personality and how you grew from that. And I think that's a lot of what programs are looking for in applicants as well, seeing how well you know yourself and translating that through your experiences and positions, work positions, volunteer positions, or whatever, and how you be a great genetic counselor out of it.
Right. I would agree with both of you. Well, all three of you. A lot of the interviews that I attended, sometimes even at the interviews, your GPA, your resume, your references were already kind of out the window. You already got to the interview, and at that point, all they wanted to do is get to know you better. They already knew that you had the qualifications. So it is really to get to know you as a person rather than for you to list off your resume and what a great person you are, because they already know that. So it's a time to get to kind of show your personality. There were a couple of things that haven't been mentioned yet that I think people should kind of prepare for, which would be ethical dilemma questions. I know one of my interviews was an MMR style, so that's multiple mini interviews. A lot of med schools do that. There's actually a lot of resources online to look at answers, how to answer those questions. And it's just good to know how to answer ethical dilemma questions because you are going to be dealing with that during your rotations, during school, and then when you're out in the field. Nobody tells you what's right or what's wrong, so you're going to have to figure that out for yourself. And then for myself, I took a gap year and got asked a couple of times what I was doing during that time, why I chose to do that. So make sure you have an answer ready for that if you're not applying right out of undergrad.
And I'd add on to that, keeping in mind a couple genetic counseling sessions that stand out to you in some way, or if you only saw a couple, of picking one of them. In my essay, I did write about one of mine that really stuck out to me, and I'm like always going to remember. And I found myself in the interviews bringing that up, and I'm like, why am I bringing this up? I've already said that during my personal statement, because you only have so much opportunity to, show yourself as a professional, as a person. So I think it's great to have a couple of those ideas in mind. And I found myself at a couple interviews asked by different people if I could, share about a genetic counseling session I attended. So I would say have two in your mind that you didn't talk about during your personal statement. And another one is an example of you working with diversity and being in a diverse culture of some kind. I think that one was hit by most of the schools that I was interviewing at. And in general, I think they're really looking to see, do you know what genetic counseling is? And are you going to be a good genetic counselor? I think those are really the two things to keep in mind during interview days. Because as someone said earlier, if you have the GPA and, for GREs, if you're applying in the States, that's kind of been checked off at this point. So you've made it that far. They don't really care about that anymore. They're really looking at, the genetic counselor in you and everything. And someone else, I think Brynna brought up that it's good to ask questions about the specific school so that you do look interested. And looking up the faculty ahead of time and all of that is really going to make you look like a better applicant. And I do want to mention some interview questions that either I was surprised by or that people in the genetic counseling community were surprised by. A little while ago on Twitter, there was a conversation on #GCChat. And some of those were... I'll start out with a question that I got that I kind of had an issue with. I'll see what you guys think. How many and which GC schools I applied to? I found that kind of inappropriate because I didn't ask about their applicants. And if I applied to a lot, maybe it shows that I'm not as interested in them, even if that's not the case. What did you guys think by this, if you weren't asked by that?
I was asked about it at a number of schools. And I didn't really think too much about it. I think they all recognize that everybody's applying to multiple schools and it's such like a small pool. But I have heard, at least from other people too, that sometimes they'll look and see if there's like one interview that's kind of the odd man out, whether it's by location or like the timeline for clinical rotations or something, and use that to kind of read a little bit more into it. But I don't think it's something that they pay that much attention to.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as Katie. Personally for me, I didn't really feel offended when schools asked me that. I felt like it was more just interested in what kind of programs you were looking at and where you wanted to go. But I would hope, that programs won't look poorly if you did different, geographic regions. Because for me, I applied anywhere that I thought I would live, including on the East Coast, in the West Coast, in the middle of the States, anywhere. And I don't really think that would really have a bad reflection on who you are as an applicant, but I feel like it's more out of curiosity's sake.
That's fair. I remember thinking, along the lines of what Kira was saying, that I would be a bit uncomfortable in a situation where, imagine you applied for 11 or 12 different schools, or even more than that, and you got one interview and it was something you were a bit worried about and the school asked you. I could understand maybe being a bit worried about how that reflects on you. If they say, how many did you apply to and how many are you interviewing at? And you say, I applied to 12 and I'm interviewing with just you. I wonder how that would affect how they see you. I don't know, just something I would personally think about.
Yeah, I think you guys raise a lot of good points, and there can be some curveball questions out there, and some, are appropriate, I think, and some not so much. Ones that I've heard from, multiple people are asking about relationship status. I guess they could be viewing that of, do you have a support system? Are you moving with your partner? But I don't know, seems a little bit intrusive to me.
And it could really catch you off guard too. It's something that, prepare.
Yes.
Going into an interview, prepare for a potentially a question that could really put you off guard, and make sure you can, get back on track really quickly after.
Yeah, and even explaining a certain grade that they can bring up your transcript. And I had that and kind of said, well, yeah, I didn't do too well in orgo, and I'm not going to be a chemist. So, sometimes I don't know if that's like too witty of an answer, I guess. But, being able to explain those and think about that ahead of time for your lower grades. Now, for those of us that had multiple interviews, how did we keep them kind of separate in our minds?
I think I mentioned I had 6 interviews total. And I kept them separate by keeping notes after every single interview. Even after each individual person, if I could, just like jot down a couple of words so I could remember that specific interview, pros, cons, whatever it was. And then as I went through the interview process, I kind of started forming my rank list as I went. So like my third interview, I already had 2 on my list, kind of ranked 1 and 2 for those ones, and then would just have to insert my like third interview into that, whether I liked it better than those first 2 or like between them. That way I could kind of not have to remember every detail later on, but already had a general sense of what I liked the most, what I liked the least.
I was just saying, I agree. The pros and cons list, like immediately after, was something really important for me too. I found that one thing I looked for, and this is something I jotted down immediately after the interview, is what did the relationship look like between the current students, because we got to meet them at a lot of mine, and the program directors. Did it seem like it was a positive and comfortable relationship or a strained one? And so it was something I just kind of got my own feel of, and I actually jotted that down after each one, just so in my first year when I had the 3 interviews, and it really helped me at the end in my mind, kind of organizing them.
Yeah, I did similar things on my way home from interviews because I drove everywhere. I would do a little like audio recording of myself. So I would say just like, stream of consciousness, what I thought, different things that happened. And so I went back and listened to those as I was ranking. And I think that kind of helped because I had a lot of interviews that were very close together. So, where I had maybe 3 days and I was going to 3 different schools. So things can definitely start blurring in your mind. And so I think it's helpful to somehow in your own way keep track of these things. And we keep mentioning this match system, which, can seem like a huge black box to some, myself included. Can someone explain really how the match system works?
Yes, I can try to explain from what I understand, but I'm sure the other girls will back me up and add in some missing details. But from what I gather, the match system is essentially the same for when you are a resident and you're trying to match up with a residency program. What happens is that you are able to rank the programs that you interviewed at. So I had 2 interviews, so I was able to rank those 2 programs. On the opposite end, the programs will rank all the applicants that they received and rank who they like the most, the least, all in chronological order. And then from there, all of these ranking lists are input into an algorithm. And then on the 27th, on match day, the results are spit out and you're matched or not matched with a program, depending on where you are on their list and where they are on your list.
And I think it's important to note, too, that the algorithm is in favor of the applicant or the student applying. And that's something really important for everyone to remember when making your match list. So, for example, if you have one school that you are most interested in attending and another school that you think is more likely to accept you, you don't have to put the one that's more likely to accept you first just to try and, increase your odds of getting into any school. You can put it in the order that you most favor, and it will actually work in your benefit. The match system has an online video that explains the algorithm and explains how it does this. So that's a really useful resource for anybody who wants to look into a little bit more about how the algorithm works.
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of schools have different tracks that they have. So for some of them, it might be a scholarship or fellowship track versus just the regular track. So I had a couple of those. And then at UAB, they actually have a bunch of different tracks because they do a second year, semester, or year-long rotation in another state. So you're in 2 different locations the second year. And each one of those tracks had to be ranked differently within the match system. So while I had 6 schools I had to rank, I also had to include different scholarship location tracks. So keep that in mind, that maybe you want to go to this school with this location for rotations, or this school with this scholarship, but have different ideas for what it would be if it was a different location or without that scholarship. So you do still have that say in kind of pricing, location kind of thing.
It's a lot to take in, and definitely you have to sit down with it and kind of go through everything. Yeah. And your rank list can be potentially very long, because for a lot of my schools, there were 3 or even 4 different tracks. So I applied to 7, but I think my list was, 22, items long because of that. And you can kind of mix and match
exactly
the different schools. So you don't have to put all the schools ranked together. You can if you want to. If you want to say, hey, I want to go to, say I'm going to Sarah Lawrence. I'm going to go to Sarah Lawrence. I really want to go. So I'm going to put all my tracks as the top 3. And that's what I actually did. But you can say I wanted to go to another school and said, well, if I get a really sweet scholarship from school X, maybe I'll put that right under Sarah Lawrence's scholarship. So you really can play around with it. And so that's something we definitely recommend doing. And this is not something to do the night before. It's really thinking about during your interview process of where you're ranking. What factors did you guys focus on when assessing these programs and starting to rank them? What ended up being the most important aspects to you? I know we've talked about location a lot.
Yeah, so actually for me, location was one of my biggest ones, because I was curious to know what it was like to live on in a different geographic location. But I also wanted to make sure that my learning style fit well with the program and the faculty, as well as getting a feel for how the faculty and the students interact with each other as well. And actually the reason why I chose my top choice was, while it was due to location, I kind of felt later on that maybe it wasn't the best fit for me in terms of personality-wise, because when you're interviewing for all these programs, it's important to remember that you'll be there for about 2 years and these people will be your main support system. And I realized that my personality didn't exactly fit with my top choice. So in the end, match system served me well and matched me with who better suited my needs. But in hindsight, it's really important to listen to that gut feeling and your initial reactions when you first interview and go to the campus and everything.
I also considered a lot about the NSGC certification exam. So I asked in my first year when I applied at multiple, all of the schools, how their students, ranked, I guess, or how they did on the certification exam. What was their percentage of success on the first writing? And I found that one of the schools had a very high success rate. And to me, that showed me that they really prepared their students, and the program they offered essentially prepared them maximally for the certification exam and the career. So that was something I focused a lot on when I considered my rank list in the first year. Not that I had to make one in the first year, but pros and cons.
Right. I think I would echo Brynna in saying that, basically overall feel is probably the biggest thing that I paid attention to. It sounds kind of silly when you hear about it before you actually go and interview somewhere, but when you're at a school, you do get a sense of kind of what the culture is within the program, how close students are with each other and with the program director. I was really surprised at how much I could pick up on just the overall feel of the program. And then I looked a lot at rotation schedules when they started, what kinds of rotations they had, what specialties there were, because there are schools that have you're in a different clinic every 3 days or something, versus schools where you're in the same clinic, shadowing with working with the same people for 6 weeks on end. And just depends on what your personal preference is on which one you like better.
Yeah, there's so many things to consider. Like, we could keep going on and on, I'm sure. And our blog post at dnapodcast.com will have a lot more information in terms of things that we were like, oh, we should have mentioned this during the episode. But before we wrap up, I did want to talk about if we ended up getting our top match or within a top few, so people can kind of, know what to expect for, is it possible I could get my last match or in the middle?
Yeah, I was not matched with my top match, which it had kind of a lot of mixed feelings just on match day, because there's a lot of information that you have to kind of sort through and figure out, and it's a long process. But I love the school I'm at now. I'm super excited for second year coming up pretty soon. I'll get to go to Memphis for that, so it'll be cool to get to go to a new place. And I think it's important with that to remind everybody that you should only rank schools that you would be happy going to.
Yes.
Because you could get that last match, and if you wouldn't be happy going there, please don't write it down.
Yeah, echoing what Katie said, I actually didn't get into my top choice, but it was within the top few because I only I only had an interview at 2 schools. But I want to say that I'm so happy with the outcome. Honestly, if I had to choose again, I definitely mix up my rankings for sure, but the match system really has your preferences at heart. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just end up where you're supposed to be and things just fall into place. And I know that sounds super lame for those of you who are currently in that application process, but it's really true. I mean, if it's really where you're supposed to be, then things will work out. And if not, then, I mean, it's only for 2 years and you still have the rest of your life to go somewhere else. And like Katie said, if you really don't want to go to a program, then please don't rank it.
And you're still going to be a genetic counselor. That's the real end game goal. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for myself, I did get my top match. I interviewed at 1 school this year, and it was my top match. However, had I interviewed at all 3, the school that I got accepted at would have been my top rank. So really excited for that.
So it really does kind of all work out in the end. And, being a genetic counselor is very exciting in itself. We're all very excited to, be joining the field and grad school and everything. So as a reminder, I'm Kira Dineen, and I'm going to Sarah Lawrence.
I'm Katie. I'm at UAB.
And I'm Brynna, and I'm at the University of British Columbia.
I'm Brynna, and I'll be going to KGI. And also, if you're interested in learning more information or resources for prospective or current genetic counseling students, I'm also a contributor on the Maps and Genes blog, which you can go to at mapsandgenes.wordpress.org. So if you're interested, click on to see what we do over there.
And some more resources that we mentioned in our first episode together back in August. AboutGeneticCounselors.com has so many resources, including a link to FindAGeneticCounselor.com to get experience with job shadowing. Grad Cafe is a really great resource for meeting applicants like ourselves. We were all pretty active on Grad Cafe, and it's good to ask each other questions. And, it's a safe community because you can be anonymous, or you can kind of, put yourself out there. And the last one is the Discord app. I discovered this very late in the game, and I wish I had discovered it sooner. So there is a genetic counseling community on there, and that's even more active. That's like as active as a group meet can be sometimes. So you can go to dnapodcast.com, as I said, for that blog post with over 50 genetic counseling applicants from last year's cycle on talking about what their experiences have been. I've compiled that all into one. On Twitter at DNA Podcast, Instagram at DNA Radio, and questions. If you have questions for us, please send them in. info@dnapodcast.com. We may be able to answer your questions that are more specific, and it's possible, because we're very spread out in North America with this panel, that we actually interviewed at one of the schools or applied to one of the schools that you're also interviewing or applying at. So do not be shy. You can even write in the person that you're trying to reach, or just generic email. Thanks for listening, guys, and join me next week to learn and discover the new advances in the world of genetics.